Hey there, I'm Ryan. Welcome to today's brush demonstration where we are going to show you how you can make pretty much every brush stroke you could possibly want with only 5 brushes. Now, these are what I've used for all of my realistic landscape paintings for the last 2.5 years. I love these brushes and I've never wanted another one because there's so much you can do with just 5 brushes if you're intentional. And that's what we're talking about here today. We're going to do a little demo of each. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to Pat and Derek up over on Patreon for requesting this video. I put a little Q&A section up there where you can ask me questions for more in-depth answers and videos just like this. So this is the first. I do intend to get to more of those. And if you are up over on Patreon, do go check out that post because you can leave your requests, your questions right there. Now let's talk about these brushes. We begin with the larger flat-headed brush. We do so for a couple of reasons. And these brushes are going to be a little bit messy, I'm not gonna lie to you. I've used these for the last 3 years at this point, so we do get a little bit of color on there, but I like that. It's good personality. That said, this brush is fantastic because it has a lot of surface area. This is a big spot for the brush to pick up paint. So if you're not using a palette knife to do your blends on your palette, this is the brush you wanna do it with, and you switch to a smaller brush for the actual grabbing and application. This brush is also fantastic for working on backgrounds, blocking in the initial areas of a painting. 9 times out of 10 when I'm starting a painting, I'm starting with this brush because it does just block in so much so quickly. I know when I started painting, I would work on these big canvases and I would want really big brushes for the sky. And in theory, that's great and it works, but in practicality, not so ideal. Realistically, this is a really big brush, and unless you're working on a massive palette, you're going to take up all of your space. You're not going to be able to blend properly. And so I actually moved away from using these big guys to doing my skies, even when they are quite large with this, because when you apply next to no pressure with a brush like this on the paint that you have on your canvas, and you go over it slowly back and forth, you can render no actual brush strokes or marks. It's all about getting the right amount of pressure, the right amount of water, but with this brush, you can render a really clean looking sky if you work with intentionality. When you apply a lot of pressure with this brush, typically the bristles will push pigment to the left and the right hand side, and you get this really nice streaky aesthetic, which can be great for creating detail in distant water through horizontal strokes. You can add subtle clouds in the sky using that pressure, but if you want to use a very soft application, very little pressure of the brush on the canvas, you essentially don't render any streaks. It's just so versatile, and again, this is typically the brush I start all of my paintings with. I do my mixing, I do my backgrounds. It is a staple, and it is the first thing to leave this little cute jar of brushes right here. That said, let's talk about our second brush, and that is the smaller flat-headed brush. So this is essentially the same shape. It's rectangular, it is decent for mixing. It's probably the second best brush for mixing, but I don't typically use it for that. This is used for details, sharper applications, and a lot of human-made structures. Things like brick, cobblestone, great for rendering bridges or even strips of wood. This is a fantastic brush for intentionality with sharp lines and still carrying a decent amount of paint. Much like the larger flat-headed brush, if you apply a lot of pressure with it, you get these streaks on the edge. If you apply very little pressure, then you can also get those soft blends. But this is a great staple for when you want a little bit more detail, but a similar application to the larger flathead. Now we are going to take a little coffee break right here because I'm a little sleepy today, to be honest. I love to record these videos in the morning when I have a lot of energy and I'm fresh, but admittedly I did have lunch, and now we have coffee. Thank goodness. It's an artist staple. That said, we are moving onto my favorite brush. This is the fan brush, and this is a very unique fan brush. Most people will do their paintings with 2 fan brushes, a soft bristled fan brush and a stiff bristled fan brush. And this can be both. When this brush that I'm holding right here is dry, it is essentially a stiff bristled fan brush, meaning that these bristles are all nice and hard. They don't really clump together. So when I grab paint with this, especially smaller amounts, I can go into the canvas and I can tap hundreds of little markings so quickly. And because I have paint on individual little bristles, I am rendering markings which are smaller than anything else I could do with any other brush. Even the liner brush, even the smaller little pointy brushes, they cannot make the detail that this larger fan brush does. And I typically like to use this for a lot of my detail work when rendering textures in rocks or in foliage. Sometimes it's in the tree bark, but you can also use it with a vertical stroke to render really small pieces of grass, especially in the distance. Again, these are markings which you just couldn't make with any other brush, and the stiff bristled fan brush, very specifically stiff bristled, is fantastic for that. Now you can also get a soft bristled fan brush, and that's essentially when the bristles condense together more so and it's a bit softer, there's more give. That can be great for rendering 4 or 5 markings at the same time. You can turn this brush that I'm holding into a soft bristled fan brush by dipping it in a little bit of water, wiping off the excess. It'll essentially create a forking within the brush, and then you're making, again, a couple markings. They're larger because they are condensed bristles, but this can be great for subjects like foliage in the foreground. If you've ever tried to paint individual leaves and you've done so with a liner brush or a smaller flat-headed brush, you know that takes forever. This allows it to go so much more quickly. With just a little tap, you're rendering so many more. You're adding an element of randomization, which can look great. And I think often when rendering realism, a pitfall a lot of artists fall into is they're too intentional with their applications. In our heads, we kind of create patterns which we don't realize, and we interject those into the canvas, and we make it look less organic and less natural than it should. This brush keeps it natural and different because you do a little tap, and then you rotate, and you do another little tap, and you do a rotation, you do another tap. Every time you do that, you get a completely different marking, and it's always unique, and it takes the really stiff, structured look out of your foreground foliage. That happens with a soft bristled fan brush. Again, this can be both. Before I had this brush, I would use both a soft and a stiff bristled, but if you would actually like to use exactly this brush, you can get it in the description. These are all part of my brush set. I love them. I've done 50 paintings since, and I've never wanted another brush. That said, this brush, fantastic for organic detail. The liner brush, fantastic for intentional detail. And I typically like to use this brush in conjunction with that brush when rendering really complex, ordinary subjects. So when I want the base of the grass or the foliage, I use the fan brush. When I want to go in and refine it, that's when I grab the liner. And this brush right here is fantastic for those intentional details. Again, if you try to do every detail with this brush, it would take forever. It might look a little stiff. That's why we do both. But this is fantastic for really shaping things the way you want them to be shaped. Now, when it's dry, it's going to be a little bit bigger. It's going to be a little bit fluffy. We typically don't paint with this brush dry. We dip it in a little bit of water. We wipe off the excess. It condenses the bristles to make it an even sharper brush. And then we can really get into the details. Now, the amount of water you apply to this brush matters greatly. And this actually goes for a lot of the brushes, but predominantly this one because it is the real detail heavy brush. When you apply a lot of water, it can be difficult to render sharp details because you get these little globs of water on your canvas. They're quite large and it's difficult to work with. When you have just a little bit of water, it condenses the bristles. You're able to get that extra glide on the canvas, and that's fantastic. When it's dry, again, it's a little bit big, but the water does help. And another thing that can help render detail with this brush is pressure. We talked about pressure with the larger flathead. When you go over it softly, you typically get soft blends. When you apply a lot of pressure, you get these streaks. This brush, a little bit different. When you apply it softly, you get a very small, minute marking. We're just touching the end of the bristles to the pigment on the canvas, and at that point you're getting a really little mark. When you apply a lot of pressure with this brush, the bristles leaf out and you end up getting a much larger marking, which sounds bad. It's actually not. It's really good because a singular brush like this can render incredibly tiny markings when you apply a little bit of pressure, or larger, sharp markings when you want them. And you can progressively change, essentially on a gradient on a scale, from incredibly detailed to larger and prominent. And when you're working on finite grass in that background, you want it to be small and definitive. When you go to the foreground, you might want it to be much larger and prominent. So the singular brush can do all of it and all of the applications in between simply by measuring the amount of pressure you apply with this. regardless of that, you do want it to be a little bit damp, but this is an incredibly versatile brush. And I think a lot of people have a wide variety of liner brushes, but if you know how to use yours and you're going into it with intentionality, you can render so many different markings, and you just don't have to buy 20 different liner brushes. One of them is perfect if you know how to use it. That really goes for all of these brushes. Again, you could go out and you could buy a bunch of stiff bristled fan brushes. You could also buy soft bristled fan brushes. You can jump back and forth between them. That's something, again, I did for years until I made this one. But if you have the right brushes, you don't need to go out and buy too many. And I say that because I was definitely this way. I think a lot of artists are this way. When you start painting, you go to the art store and you see all of these brushes on the wall and you think, I want that one and that one and that one, and they can get really expensive. Sometimes a singular brush is $35. You walk out of there spending $300-400, and you could have spent a third of that. All of that said, we are going to jump back into our brushes here. We do have the Filbert brush, and as you can see, this has these beautiful rounded corners. Wonderful for soft blends, wonderful for portrait painting, wonderful for doing things like mist or clouds, things without a definitive edge to them. And with most of these brushes, I do like to keep them damp. This one has some exceptions, as does this one. We already talked about this, but here, if you want your markings to be incredibly transparent, again, with mist, with clouds, then you do make this brush a little bit damp. If you want your clouds and your mist to be a little bit more opaque and have slightly more control, then I would actually leave it dry and do a dry brush technique, because it can be fantastic. I'll do, again, demos just so you can see what I'm talking about. But I love this brush because it lets me get those soft applications later in the painting process. I also like to use it for snow because it allows me to get a sharp top line using the top of the brush, and then I kind of turn the brush to the point where the bottom of it is this rounded area, so the top is sharp, the bottom has a soft blend. So you get these really unique applications, which would be difficult to get with anything else. So this is a unique brush. This is a brush that I think is a staple, much like the rest of these. You can get different applications whether you're using it wet or dry. That said, I hope this was helpful. I hope you feel like you learned something. I hope you feel ready and excited to go out and create your own works. I would like to say a big thank you yet again to both Pat and Derek for suggesting we do a video in depth on the brushes, how to use them, how to render those fine details. Thank you again to everybody supporting the channel up directly over on Patreon. This channel is predominantly community funded, and I'm able to make these videos, the big long lessons, because of you. So thank you for being here. Thank you for making this happen. If you're new here, do consider subscribing. I post these really long, realistic painting tutorials pretty much every week. And if you'd like me to make a video on your question, you can leave that in the Patreon post linked down below. I've really enjoyed reading a lot of them. I intend to make a lot more videos just like this, doing deep dives on the topics you want. So I'll see you soon with that. I am working on the next lesson. And if you are up over on Patreon, I will be posting a bonus video today, so you have something else to watch. So go and check that out. Thank you for being here. I'll see you soon. And above all, as always, you stay creative. More coffee. Always more coffee.